If only your heart line could give you a play-by-play of your love life over your entire lifetime. That's what most people want to know from their love line. But that's not necessarily how palmistry works. Now, the heart line is more like in alignment with the heart chakra. So what it will reveal about you is more about how you love than it is about who you love or the love stories that play out in your actual life experience. You can liken the creases on your hands to that of a river. So the deeper and broader the line, the more power that line carries in your life. So the heart line is on the top of the hand, and it travels from one end all the way up between the first two fingers, usually. Now, some people have shorter heart lines, longer heart lines. Some people have broken heart lines and islands on the line and things like that. So each of these different heart lines mean a different way of loving in the world. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Someone with a very strong and clear heart line is very lucky in love. In fact, this person might actually take their self-worth for granted because they are so loved by people outside of themselves in their day-to-day life. Someone with a very deep and clear heart line have the love of others very easily at their disposal. So what they may need to learn is to value their self as much as they value the love of other people in their lives as well. Now, some heart lines are considered long heart lines, while some are considered short heart lines. So generally speaking, if your heart line reaches from the outer edge of your palm all the way up in between the first two fingers, that would be considered a long heart line. So if you have a long heart line, then you definitely have a capacity for loving, friendly relationships, and you can be empathetic and compassionate towards others. Someone with a short heart line is sometimes referred to as someone who is very selfish and unreasonable. In general, they're too worried about their own problems to even consider other people in their lives. And in many instances, people with a very short heart line are people who are alcoholics or addicted to other things. So therefore, they just simply don't have time for a true loving relationship. Now, if you have a curved heart line, so one that actually curves the way up, then that type of heart line shows someone who has a large amount of love and affection. The people with the curved heart line love children, animals, friends, family, and they have a capacity for a very strong romantic relationship as well. The people with the more curved heart line will listen to their friends and relationships in their life, but in general, they're going to follow their heart and seek what they desire more than anything else in the world. People with a very straight heart line are the type of people who might actually choose their romantic partnerships and other relationships based on what fits them and how they think and how they believe. So, for instance, someone with a very straight heart line may choose a partner based on their beliefs, their religion, or even their social class. Basically, it won't be based on love, but based on what works for everybody in a very reasonable way. So the person with a very straight heart line would make a very good business associate or even a very good friend. But Sometimes in relationships, they can be a little more detached and cold. A heart line that is very shallow would belong to someone who really wants a romantic, loving relationship. But once they get into the relationship, it seems like something always gets in the way. So whether it's kind of they are bent towards being argumentative or trying too hard to rule over the other person in the relationship, or sometimes that could also mean that the person just has other things on their mind in the end. So maybe they are addictive or something along those lines. And basically, while a loving relationship is the desire of the person with the shallow heart line, they always allow something else to get in the way of a successful relationship. If the heart line is broken, like in one spot, but then continues, that would represent a really big life-changing heartbreak that took place in the subject's life. But if the line is very fragmented, so broken in multiple places, then that would represent someone who's really fun and good company and a great friend to have. But that person is probably a little harder to live with as far as a romantic partnership is concerned. So the person with a very fragmented heart line would make a great business person, a fun party friend, but in general maybe would be a little bit tougher and more argumentative as an actual romantic partner. Some people only have a partial heart line, so it can start on this end of the hand, but then it fizzles out or ends early before it can curve up into the finger. In that case, it could indicate a major relationship in your life that still never really took off or got off the ground. Now, if later after a long break there is still another line up between the first two fingers, that could indicate that you still find happiness later on in life. Some other factors of the heart line that you may want to pay attention to would be islands or other little lines coming off of the heart line. So in many cases, if you see an island on the heart line, so a line that creates a little space like an island somewhere along your heart line, that could represent a massive heartbreak. For instance, if there is an island upon your heart line just under the Apollo finger, that could represent your spouse actually passing away unexpectedly or simply unexpectedly leaving the relationship. But as long as the line continues on after the island up toward the finger, then that means that you will still have love and find love even after this massive heartbreak. If your heart line has extra lines coming off of it near the finger end of the line, those are friendship lines. So if you have a strong, deep heart line anyway, you know you already have the capacity to love animals, children, and other people in your life. But if you have those extra friendship lines coming out from the heart line, that is a good sign that you have many, many friendships. If you have very short lines that curve upward from the heart line, that actually represents that you have a very flirtatious nature. So you can sometimes be known as a flirt if those lines appear on your hand. The headline is one of the major lines in palmistry, and this particular line reveals your education, your relationship with money, your career, as well as your hobbies and interests in many cases. So the headline is associated with how your mind works. And so it can reveal quite a bit about a person. To find the headline, you simply just look for the major line right under the heart line. And we have talked about the heart line in a couple of previous videos. So that is the top major line. Now the headline is the second major line that you see moving across your palm. So the headline is just under the heart line, and it starts on this side of the hand, the thumb side, and generally just moves across the palm, sometimes with a little slope, and sometimes it's straight. Generally speaking, there are a couple of different ways your headline can show up. There is either a straight headline that just moves straight across the hand, or there's going to be a sloping headline, which will slope ever so gently downward on the palm. The straight headline, indicated by the letter A in the image, is more of a practical and logical mind, and this person strives for success. Now, a lot of times a person with the straight line could be very good with mathematics, science, information technology, and those type of things with this very logical and practical way of thinking. So the straight line person could also be very involved in politics as well. Now, if you have the sloping headline, the line that slopes gently downward towards the end, is someone who has a very creative imagination. So this person can also be very successful in business because not only can they be practical, but they can also be creative and imaginative. The person with the sloping headline can also tap into their intuition. Your headline could be long or it could be short. So if you have a very long and straight headline, then you never stop learning throughout your entire life. But if the long line is rather straight, then what you learn could just generally be tied in with your career. If the line that is long and straight reaches all the way over to the percussion end of the palm, then that could represent someone who will be traveling a lot in connection with the business or career, or could have, business ties with someone outside of the country. If your headline is very long, but curving down towards the Mount of Luna, so downward long headline would represent someone who is very imaginative and creative, but also overly sensitive at times when it comes to the emotions. So the person who has a very long, but yet very curved straight line, or not straight line, a long but curved headline could be someone who is like an artist or a poet, but who can generally be a little oversensitive, possibly due to some type of childhood trauma that took place or something along those lines. They could just be very, very connected to their emotions. A person who has a very short but straight headline could represent someone who is an expert in a particular field. So someone who studies and just, immerses themselves into a particular subject may have a very short and straight headline. Now, if you have a very short and straight line that suddenly plunges downward at the very end, then that could also represent someone who has a quick temper or who uses a lot of sarcasm. Now, as you look at the beginning of your headline, make note on if your lifeline, which comes down the palm from the thumb side, if these two lines are tied or connected or cross in some way, then that means something different than if you have a free headline that isn't fully connected to the lifeline. If you have a tied headline indicated by the letter A in the image, then this could mean that your life is heavily influenced by your parents, your background, history, or your culture. Now, this could be a good thing, or it could also be that you left home early because you had some type of dysfunction in the family home. And if that's the case, with the tied headline, then that dysfunction or your parents' voices may continue to echo inside of your head throughout your life. Now, the tied headline can also represent someone who is tied to the family or background in other ways, such as, if you're a farmer and you're going to take over the family farm, or if your parents have a big business or something along those lines, where it's like you're very tied to your upbringing and it's going to be that way for the rest of your life. Now, if you have a free headline indicated by the letter B in this image, then you're very optimistic and you have the courage to make your own way. Now, these people can leave their neighborhood or where they grew up, but you don't have to. You can also remain close to family. Basically, your parents and family gave good validation and encouragement, and you had the freedom to choose which way you want to go in life if you have a free headline. If the area between your headline and your lifeline looks like a game of cat's cradle, then that shows that you may have hated learning in school or in the school setting. Or it could also mean that you loved the school setting because it was an escape from, a repressive or dysfunctional family situation going on at home. Now I just want to go over some common disturbances that you may find on the headline and what those common disturbances might mean. So if you have an island on your headline, this can obviously represent some type of disturbance going on in your thinking. So I drew this to show you what an island would look like. Basically, it's just like this little island in the middle of the line, okay? So if you have some type of island on your headline, then this represents some type of challenge that you're going through, whether it be financial, in your career, or simply just being unhappy in your current life situation. But it is usually going to be tied with career. If the island on your headline forms a diamond or a triangle, that could indicate that you have or might in the future even spend some time in prison based on some bad choices. Also, it has been said that if you have like a chain of small islands across the headline, that could actually indicate that you suffer from headaches or migraines. If you have a fork on your headline or at the end of your headline, which I do, but it's very light, so I'm not sure if it'll pick it up, but my headline kind of dips down and at the very end, it forks in the two different directions. So that is called the writer's fork. So anyone with this marking, it can basically just indicate that they're very good at expressing themselves with words or with writing. These people also have various different interests, and their hobbies can actually be very absorbing. And all of that is true for me in the situation of having the fork. Now, the writer's fork on the hand is also basically, you may do something ordinary for a living, but you also have something very expressive or artistic that you do outside of your career. So whether or not you're, using your creative expression to make money or income, you definitely spend a lot of your time using your creative expression in your life, one way or another. If you have a break in the headline, that is where the line is traveling across the hand, stops, has a space, and then picks back up. Then that may indicate taking a little time away from work due to some kind of illness or something along those lines, or even something associated with the mind or the head. Now, generally speaking, since it's only a break, it's just like some time away. It's not like a complete ending, right? If you have some interference lines that are traveling up through the headline, then that could just represent some type of unpleasantness in your life at a particular point. Now, if that line is going from the lifeline upwards through the headline, then this could actually indicate some type of bullying from within the family or like from in-laws. And I do actually have a line starting at my lifeline and moving up through my headline. And it is very true that my mother-in-law and I didn't always get along. And there were many times where I actually felt like I was being bullied by her. So for me, that line is true. If your headline happens to have multiple different interference lines coming off of it, like tassels, breaks, islands, and all kinds of stuff going on, it could just indicate that your mind is not at ease. And it's hard for you to get yourself together when it comes to your thinking. Or in a lot of cases, these people are simply overthinking things and possibly even sabotaging their own happiness based on this, overactive mind that they can't seem to keep under control. The lifeline is one of the main lines in palmistry, and it can reveal many things about your lifetime. The lifeline is the line that travels from the Mount of Jupiter, which is this little mount of flesh right here below your index finger, and it travels toward the Mount of Venus, which is this mound of flesh right here near your thumb. The lifeline doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how long your life is going to be, but it tells you more about the general trends of your lifetime, such as the health of your physical body, or if you have a lean towards spirituality, or even your childhood trauma. The lifeline can also tell you if you are likely to travel abroad or be more focused on family or your career. So let's go ahead and take a look at the lifeline and see exactly what it is that you can learn from this line. Your lifeline can be long or short, and it doesn't necessarily determine if your life will be long or short. Many times, if you have a short lifeline, it is generally because it breaks off and moves off to the side down a little further. And my lifeline actually does have a little break in it and many different disturbances, which we will be going over what those might mean. If you have a break in your lifeline, this could represent a time in your life where everything just changes suddenly. This could be the loss of someone through death or through the ending of a relationship, such as a divorce. This could also represent things like winning the lottery or getting a huge promotion or something like that, where your life situation just suddenly changes. So breaks are quite often seen in the lifeline because many of us out there have had situations that kind of changed the path of our lives. I know that I have, and I have a break on my lifeline to prove it. If you have a small fork on your lifeline, that could mean that you are able to have your hand in multiple things at once with a balance. So maybe someone who can have a good balance between their family life and their career, or somebody who moved away from family, but they can come home often to visit, or something along those lines. Now, if you have a long and narrow fork, then that would represent a lifetime or a time in the life where it's more of a struggle or difficulty. And this could represent situations such as being a single parent, raising a child alone. If your lifeline just kind of tassels off at the end, rather than making a fork or just ending abruptly, then those tasseling lines would represent your death being due to a longer period of time with bad health or some kind of illness. So it would be unlikely that your death would be by some type of surprise or accident with that marking. If your lifeline just ends abruptly, then it is likely that you will have generally pretty good health all the way up until the end of your life. And so you won't have that period of time where you may be suffering from some kind of disease or illness. The start of the lifeline up near the Mount of Jupiter can actually be either very clear or, kind of messy with a lot of lines all around. And so if the start of your lifeline is very clear, then you had a very uneventful, for the most part in a good way, childhood, which had no real problems. Now, if the start of your lifeline is a little messy, then there is a likelihood that your childhood had some type of difficulties involved in it. If you have islands early on in the lifeline, then the islands there could represent that you had some type of possible health problem in childhood. And lines that move downward from the lifeline early on could mean that possibly you lost someone who meant a lot to you early in your life. Islands on the lifeline in general represent basically a period of difficulty in one's life, and it could have to do with a multitude of things. The difficulty could be in the person's health, or maybe in their finances, their career, or even in their relationships. So it just kind of depends on the person when it comes to that island. But regardless, the island itself represents that energy of just going through a period of difficulty in one's life. Now, a lifeline that actually bows really far out into the hand, creating a very large Mount of Venus, could represent someone who has a very strong passion for life and basically wants to live life to the fullest. Now, if the lifeline is a little bit straighter, causing this Mount of Venus to be a little smaller, then that would mean that the person with that line is more of a thinker and dreamer, and possibly even less interested in making money. And the person who has a line that comes all the way down around the thumb, that could represent somebody who is very close to their home life. And so that person is very much connected to their family. Your lifeline can either be tied to the headline or it can be separate from the headline. So, interestingly, on my left hand, my dominant hand, my lifeline is tied to my headline. But on my non-dominant hand, my lifeline is actually separate from my headline. If you have a tied lifeline, meaning that the lifeline is connected or crossing with the headline, then that would mean that you stayed in your home with your family for a long time before moving out on your own, or you're deeply connected with your family. Now, if your lifeline and headline are separated, then that would mean that you left home at an early age. Now, for me, on my non-dominant hand, my lifeline is separated. So it is true, I did leave my home at an early age to start my own independent life. But with my lifeline being tied on my dominant hand, that is also true, because while I went my own way, I did return back to my family home at one time. Not only that, but once I had my children, my parents played a big role in helping me to raise them. Therefore, I wasn't fully independent from my parents after all. Now, if you have parallel lifelines, which are two lines that run directly next to each other, then that would represent something called a parallel line, or sometimes called a shadow line or a sister line. Basically, having these parallel or shadow lines running some length of your lifeline, then that represents that you have a lot of spiritual protection and also an inclination to look into things such as hand reading or your clairsenses and all of those spiritual topics. So the sister lines or parallel lines are lines indicating that you have this knack for spirituality. And I do have these parallel lines as well. If you have many disturbances on your lifeline, such as bars or islands or, basically a bunch of lines coming off of your lifeline, those could represent different difficulties or traumas that have happened along the way. So you may even find more of that timeline if you take a look at your non-dominant hand, if you notice that you do have a lot of disturbances on your lifeline. Because a lot of those disturbances show up from past events that have taken place and have just kind of marked you with some type of trauma from the experience. If you have a line that comes off of the lifeline moving upward after an island, that actually shows a period of self-motivation that was following that particular difficulty. So it's like you were able to bring yourself out of that difficult situation. And lines that move downward from the lifeline would represent things that have fallen away from your life. And these could be anything like relationships or careers that weren't going the way that you wanted them to. So the downward moving lines represent things that just fall away. The fate line is a line on the palm that can tell you quite a bit about a person and the life that they live. So the fate line usually starts somewhere in the lower portion of the palm and moves up towards the finger of Saturn, which is your middle finger. So just look at your palm and see what line goes through the palm and up towards this finger, and that will be your fate line. Now, some people have a very, very faint fate line, and some people claim they don't have a fate line at all. So if that's the case for you, if you have a very, very faint fate line or none at all, it just means that you may live a very mundane and ordinary existence, and you may be someone who's not particularly bothered by what other people think of you, or bothered by money or relationships or anything like that. Now, another thing about the fate line is that this line could sometimes start late and be strong, and sometimes it starts early and then just kind of fizzles out before it reaches the finger of Saturn. Now, in those cases where the line starts early and fizzles out, that would mean that the individual likely had a quick start in life and then was able to be more laid back and easygoing later in life. And of course, if the line starts later on the hand or farther up and then finishes towards that finger, that means that that person had a slower start in life and then became more motivated as the years went on and later on in life. I'm going to start by talking about where the fate line begins. So if you take a look at your dominant hand, and I'm left-handed, so this is my dominant hand, take a look at where your fate line begins. Again, it's the line that goes upward toward the middle finger. My fate line begins at the bottom here in the lower portion of my hand. So generally, people who have a fate line that starts in this lower portion of the palm, that generally means that the subject or whoever has this line had an early start to their life. They likely moved out of their family home at a younger age than some other people and started to make their way early on. And that happens to be true for me. If your fate line starts inside or as part of the lifeline, then that would indicate that your family has held you back in some way. This could mean that you're treated as a child, even into your adult years, by family members. Or it could mean that, like, maybe you have a family business that you are being forced to take over, or you simply do what you're told by your family, even if it goes against what you really want to do. If the fate line begins near the lifeline, but is not connected to the lifeline, then that would represent that you had a good upbringing and were offered a good education by your family, but when the time came, they allowed you to grow up and go your own way. The cool thing about the fate line is that while it's not 100% accurate on timing, you can get a feel for around the ages or times that things may happen in life. So if you have lines entering into your fate line in this lower portion, that would represent something that happens by the age of 23 or younger. Now, if lines are entering the fate line between the head and the heart line, then that would indicate between the age of around 35 to 50. And if it's above the heart line, then that would be your age 50 to 55 and older. Now, if you have lines entering into the fate line from either side of your hand, those lines represent important people in your life. Now, these are not short-term relationships that come and go, but these would represent something significant and big in your life. So, for me, for instance, I have a line coming in way down here at the bottom. So this would indicate that I was ready for marriage at a very young age. I was ready to take on a full-on relationship and be with my person since before the age of 23. So if you have any lines entering in at the lower end of the fate line, then that may be the same case for you, where you're just ready for marriage and ready to begin a life with someone, with a life partner, from a very young age. Now, if these important person lines that are coming into the fate line enter in from the thumb side, so they're coming into the line from this side of the hand, that would represent someone you met through family, school, or the workplace. Basically, it represents someone that you will meet and marry who came from a familiar environment to you. If your important relationship lines come in from this side of the hand, so if they're coming in as little lines from that side into the fate line, then those would just represent someone that you will end up meeting or have met that was not a neighbor, a family member, someone you met at school or at work. It's basically someone that you met outside of your familiar territory. Now, you may also see very fine lines coming out on this side of the fate line. And those very fine lines are just going to represent important friendships that come along in your life. Now, obviously, the same rule applies if your lines are coming in at a later time on your fate line. So if the lines are coming in on the thumb side for, in between the head and the heart line, then that would represent someone that you meet within familiar territory that you would meet probably after, the age of 35. And if you have lines on that other side, it could represent friendships or a partner that you meet outside of familiar territory after that age. Sometimes you might see that a person has two fate lines just running right next to each other. And so if someone has two fate lines that run parallel, then that represents someone who took a wrong path in life, and at some point they lived with a lot of resentment regarding the path they took. So this is someone who had a longer spell of bitterness and resentment in their life. Now, it could just be a passing thing, or that could be the mindset that they have for the rest of their life. It just kind of depends on where these two fate lines are running. And by the way, the lines on your hands can change based on how you change. So if you're someone living in a lot of resentment, bitterness, or just negative energy regarding a path or a choice that you've made in your life, it is never too late to change. The lines on your hand are not your permanent station in life. The lines on your hands represent your consciousness, which is ever changing and evolving. So if you want to let go of that resentment and that bitterness in your life and adopt a new way of being, or possibly go back to the other path that you should have chosen, it's never too late. And eventually the second fate line will fade away. There could also be a number of different types of disturbances that are seen on the fate line. And disturbances could be represented by islands in the line, breaks in the line, or the line could even end in a Y and then begin again. So I just want to talk about some of those different disturbances that may be observed on the fate line and what it could mean. If there's a line that seems to join the heart line and the head line in a diagonal direction, which also crosses your fate line, that represents someone who has a relationship that just comes to an end without the subject really knowing why the relationship ended. So usually it's because of a lack of any real true communication and understanding between the two people. Many palm readers believe that islands on any line will weaken the strength of energy in that line. So if you look at your fate line and see that it has any type of island within it, then that island will just represent some type of problem, or difficulty, a period of difficulty, or, some kind of problem in your life. So this could actually be referring to anything when it comes to the fate line. So it could be a career problem. It could be money problems. It could be about a relationship. It could be about health. It could be about literally anything. So the island itself is really just going to show you the type of difficulty you may have been facing. So islands can either be short and oblong in shape, or they have a long, narrow split that goes a far distance. So basically, if you look at the way the island is on your fate line, it'll give you a clue as to the nature and the length of time that you will be experiencing the problem. So if you have a very short, obvious island, it could be a difficult period that is just short but sharp and memorable. So if you have a long, narrow island or a split in the line, this could show a long period of dissatisfaction. If you notice a break in the fate line where the line is moving and then it stops and carries on later, that would represent a period of time in the subject's life where basically there was a halt in progress. So there was no movement forward in a particular direction. So, for example, a mother who ends her career to raise a baby at home may show a break in her fate line because of ending that career, for instance. But it could be any multitude of things that is represented by this break. But generally speaking, it's a time where the progress in life just kind of stops or pauses for a period of time. And sometimes on a fate line, you can even see a break that ends in a Y shape. So if you see a fate line that has a sudden ending in a Y shape and then picks up later on, that's going to represent an individual who literally just stopped and walks away. So it could be someone who just simply quits their career and walks away. Or, a husband that goes out to buy milk and never comes back. That type of energy is what you will see happening if someone has a Y break in their fate line. There's just so much that you can learn about a person by taking a look at their fate line. You can see not the exact timing of situations, but you can see a general time frame of when things are going to happen within the lifetime of a subject. And you can see if they are someone who's very individual and goes their own way, or if there's someone who just kind of goes with the flow of what everyone else is doing. There's just so much that you can learn about a person from one line on the palm of their hands.